So here we are, day 64 for me, counting the days since this began to feel very real, although it's been going on the planet for some time. And, you know, I think I really don't want to use the word unprecedented because I've heard it way, way too much in the last few months. But what we do want to talk about today is human resources and how you can make the most of the team you have and be as supportive as you can of yourselves in this very unusual time for all of us. So obviously there has been just such tragic loss around the world with this pandemic, and it continues every day as we watch the numbers. And although we are beginning to see things flatten and we're beginning to get back to work, we know that we've got a long road ahead of us. So one of the things that we believe will make a huge difference is your state of mind as you move forward through the times ahead. So I thought as we got started with our team presenting to you, Kelly Moody, who's an employment specialist with Being Human Services and who is has a degree in human resources and labor relations and is our absolute guru on labor law. Luke Napix, who's been having, and I said your name wrong again, Luke, who's been helping people get back to work and helping with employers recruit people for the last several years. And of course, myself as one of the owners of Being Human Services, I have more than 35 years of working with people, so we're bringing the strength of our team today to address how we move forward. So I want to start with a poll by asking all of you to just take a minute as we get started and say, what is your mindset as we move forward through this? Is your mindset, are you seeing mostly problems or are you seeing opportunities? So if you just take a minute and make your choice, problems is A, opportunities is B.
I apologize, Pam. I actually didn't add that poll back in. We had it in our practice, but I didn't add it back into this webinar. I apologize. So if people could just put it in the chat, that would be awesome.
On the chat would be great. So one of the problems I'm seeing sometimes is things are so different when we do things in the virtual format. It's so hard to not see your friends and hug them and greet them in that personal space, and just to be together in the personal space. So this is just one of the very small kinds of examples of how things in the virtual world are a little different and how we have to keep adapting and changing every single second of every day. And it's kind of tiring. So I really appreciate, Sandra, all your help in putting this together, because this is a new world for all of us, especially in terms of talking into the computer instead of talking into your smiling faces. So do we have any idea from the chat if we're seeing more people as opportunities? Let me see here. I'm going to just look at this. A different way, but a great learning curve. Opportunities for change, problems, opportunities. Boundless opportunities, great opportunities, opportunities. Okay. Okay, well, I'm thinking the opportunities are winning the vote. And for those of you who are seeing the problems, there's nothing wrong with that either. We all just have a different way of viewing. So what we want to do is take a look. We can't ignore the problems, obviously, but if we can be confident that we can find solutions to them. And the good news is that the framework and the practice of good human resources is there for you. And it's been there all along, and it will be there as we move forward. So I want to start by giving you the agenda for today. So today's agenda is we want to talk about human resources in the time of pandemic, the value and importance of human resources, and some fundamental practices and principles that will help you move forward. And so we brought together some of our ideas in a very short time frame. 90 minutes is not very much time to address this topic. So I'm going to mention now that we do have a workbook that we put together and we have for sale. You can order it at the end of it. It will contain all of this content plus resources and just give you a little how-to book for as you move forward for the future. So what we want to do is to start with talking about human resources in this time of pandemic. And we have heard so many questions from so many people. Suddenly there are a million questions, and I'm sure you've asked some. So just before we move to the next slide, I want you to think about what's your biggest question today what what is still on your mind? And if you could just put that in the chat. What kinds of questions are you having? Ah, this is a great one. That you don't know what you don't know. And what am I missing? And absolutely, I think that's been very much for all of us in this time. And then how do you hire back when there's such uncertainty? And it is difficult because even though there are subsidies available and there's support, it's still difficult to know how revenues are going to return to normal. So let's move on to the next slide that shows us some of those questions that we've heard. How do I keep my workforce safe in the midst of pandemic when people have to come back to work when they're not working from home? What happens when you've had to lay people off, or if you do have to lay people off in the future? There's some new rules around that. Business is booming and you're short-staffed. How do you go about recruiting? All of the information of wage subsidies and loans, and they continue to evolve every single day. And how do I apply, and what does this mean for me? And what happens if business gets better, and all of those things. Now, we can't answer all of those questions here, obviously. We're going to focus on human resources issues, but there are so many good sources that we'll point you to. Some of the other questions we've heard, does this mean it's a great opportunity to get rid of those deadweight employees without severance pay? How do I supervise people who are working from home? And what about communication with people in a remote format? How can I can be sure that if I've had to lay people off, how can I be sure to keep them engaged and get them back when I need them? How do I fill out an ROE? And what's a good recipe for bread? And I heard lots of people ran out of yeast and have discovered sourdough. And my favorite question, is it okay to drink vodka in my home office? And I won't try to even answer that one. So I'll just let you know that this morning I'm drinking water. So we'll move on to the next slide. What's the value of good human resources practice now? The value of good human resources practice is, drum roll please, next slide, the same as always. Human resource practices really help you run your business in a very constructive and positive way. It helps to manage fear and chaos. And fear and chaos didn't just, in the workplace, didn't just start with the pandemic. I think there's always a certain amount of fear of chaos, certainly in Alberta, as we watched our oil and gas prices go down, down, down. Certainly as we've watched the world changing in many, many ways over the past few years. So managing fear and chaos in our workforce is one of the tools that we have in our HR toolkit. Also, we have a structure and a system for making decisions rather than just trying to have to make them up as we go. There's a cost benefit to retaining valued workforce, and we know that it costs a lot of money to replace a worker. Maintaining good customer relationships is very, very important, and that's done through your people. And protecting your most valuable resource, your human resources, your people. And of course, maintaining a positive reputation in the community. Believe me, now people are very, very sensitive to how we treat each other, and we're seeing some of the best in each other. And of course, you want your business to shine in that direction. Next slide, please, Marcy. And finally, one of the reasons that we need to have good human resource practices and principles and policies is because the law requires us to do that. So I'm going to call on Kelly, who's our expert in this area, to take you through this piece of the presentation. So take it away, Kelly.
Perfect. Thank you, Pam. So there are 3 laws that employers should be aware of in regards to employment. There's the provincial statute law, the federal statute law, and common law. So provincial statute law has legislation such as the Alberta Human Rights Act, the Alberta Employment Standards Code, the Alberta Occupational Health and Safety Act, and depending on your organization, you might have other legislative considerations such as privacy legislation like FOIP and PIPA, or if you're unionized, you might consider the Alberta Labor Relations Code, or if your industry is not exempt, the Alberta Workers' Compensation Act. Federal statute law is typically for organizations that are federally regulated, such as banks, and they include legislation such as the Canadian Labour Code, the Canadian Human Rights Act, the Employment Equity Act, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is applicable to all organizations, and some relevant provisions include the freedom of expression, the freedom to associate, and the freedom of religion, just as some examples. And common law is based on past rulings from judges, and it often clarifies the basis for decisions when contracts or legislation is silent. Today, we're going to focus on the provincial statute law and common law, because the vast majority of organizations in Alberta are non-union and are provincially regulated. So the first provincial statute law that I'll talk about is the Alberta Employment Standards Code. So the Alberta Employment Standards Code sets out minimum terms of employment, and they talk about areas such as hours of work, leaves of absences, general holidays, overtime, and other areas. And this legislation is constantly changing. So we saw in January 2018, the NDP government made some significant changes to the Employment Standards Code. For example, they made it so that banking overtime was banked at 1.5 times for each overtime hour worked. And they introduced a lot of leaves of absences. So they introduced the personal and family responsibility leave, bereavement leave, and death and disappearance for a child, for example. They also introduced the $15 minimum wage, which was very controversial for a lot of people. And then we saw that the Conservative government came in and made some changes just recently in June and September of last year. So they reversed the banking overtime, so it's a 1-for-1 now. Each overtime hour worked can be banked at 1 hour of overtime. And they reversed the general holiday eligibility so that there's a distinguishing between a regular workday and a non-regular workday. And another example is they introduced a $13 minimum wage for students who meet certain conditions. We also have seen some temporary changes during this pandemic to the Employment Standards Code. For example, they introduced a job protected leave of absence for people who are taking care of their children due to school or daycare closures, or maybe they're taking care of an ill family member due to COVID-19. And they also removed the 24-hour notice requirement for any shift or scheduling changes. They made some changes to group terminations and averaging agreements. And then they also introduced, or they extended the temporary layoffs from 60 days to 120 days. So next slide. The Alberta Human Rights Act is another provincial statute law that protects against discrimination against individuals on the basis of a protected ground. So protected grounds include things such as source of income, mental and physical disability, marital status, age, gender identity, race, religion, and others. And it has a lot of significance with human resources. So right now, unfortunately, we're already seeing some biases and some discrimination. And it's really critical that employers remain aware of human rights when they're making decisions, for example, to recall staff. So employers should not just simply hire back Susie because she's young and healthy and not Barbara because she's an older worker. They should consider also all the time, you should consider your human rights. So one area of particular importance is when you're doing your hiring practices. When you're creating your job advertisements, doing pre-employment testing, or doing interviewing, human rights is an important factor when you're considering what you're going to be doing. For example, everybody knows that you should never ask somebody how old they are in a job interview. But we also see a lot of employers who will ask all of their job applicants to bring criminal record checks with their applications. And criminal record checks have date of birth on the information. So we actually don't recommend doing that because it can lead to a little bit of risk in regards to a human rights complaint. What we recommend is after you've done a conditional offer of employment, then asking for a criminal record check from the potential job candidate. There's also the duty to accommodate in regards to the Human Rights Act. So employers have the duty to accommodate employees, and accommodation may include modifying rules, standards, physical workplaces, so that they don't have a negative effect on a person because of their protected ground. This may create some hardship on employers in regards to time and cost, but it's required by law to the point of undue hardship. The law also recognizes that in certain circumstances that discrimination or exclusion may be allowed if an employer can show that the standard, rule, or practice is a necessary requirement for the job, or what is called a bona fide occupational requirement. Now, this doesn't mean that an employer can simply say, well, sometimes they need to pick some stuff up occasionally, so it's a bona fide occupational requirement. This is not the case. Employers have to prove and provide reasonable and justifiable evidence that this is a requirement for a job, and there's actual tests that the courts will use to determine if something is a bona fide occupational requirement. So when you're navigating the conditions of the duty to accommodate, what information you can and cannot ask an employee, and what constitutes a bona fide occupational requirement or a undue hardship is a tricky process. So when in doubt, you should always ask a professional. And there's also the Occupational Health and Safety Act of Alberta. So there's 3 rights that employees have under this act. There's the right to know about workplace hazards, the right to participate in health and safety discussions, and the right to refuse unsafe work. The right to refuse unsafe work is pretty critical right now during this pandemic, and employees have the duty to also cooperate to any reasonable accommodation that employers give. So this is an important consideration for employers. It's the employer's responsibility to protect the health and safety of all of their employees under this act. And requirements include things such as, for example, designating a health and safety representative if you have between 5 and 19 full or part-time workers. Or if you have 20 or more employees, you should designate a joint health and safety committee. And your representative or health and safety committee is required to have mandatory training that under the act you're supposed to provide to them. So I'm just going to do a poll. I'm going to see, have you implemented an emergency response plan or created a hazard assessment because of the pandemic? The Occupational Health and Safety Act is quite important right now during this time. So I just want to see, have you implemented an emergency response plan or a hazard assessment because of the pandemic? Or maybe you had one before. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to respond, or a couple seconds. All right, so results came in. Oh, good. So yes, I've implemented both, 44%. I am working on them, 44%, and I haven't and need help. So 11% said that. So that's great. So did you know that an emergency response plan and a hazard assessment, even before the pandemic, was required by all employers? So This, as well as, for example, creating a prevention plan for hazards, workplace harassment and workplace violence is also required under the Act. This is not an exhaustive list of all the requirements under the Act, but it's really important that you understand what your obligations as an employer is and that you make the changes as necessary. If you're charged for an offense under occupational health and safety legislations, the courts will look for evidence of due diligence from an employer prior to the offense happening. So evidence of due diligence includes providing training to their staff, educating their supervisors on their obligations, and having an incident reporting system are some of the areas that'll help your case to prove due diligence. And there's common law. So I have a joke, I always say knowledge of common law isn't so common. A lot of employers are really well versed when it comes to the Employment Standards Code or Human Rights Act, but a lot of them don't necessarily, they have some questions in regards to common law. So common law is based on past rulings from courts that set precedents, and they provide clarification on issues when legislation or contracts are silent. So having a good knowledge of common law will help you mitigate risk in regards to tort or contractual lawsuits. And some of the areas that are included in common law include providing reasonable notice. So for example, if you're looking at your employment contracts and you want to provide the minimum employment standards, you should state that very clearly in your employment contract. Because if not, then if you don't state that clearly in your employment contract, then you have to provide common law notice, which is often significantly more than the employment standards minimum. And when the courts are deciding how much common law you're supposed to give, they look at Bardell factors. The Bardell factors include things such as the employee's age, how long they've worked for the employer for, if there's available similar employment, and what the nature of the work involves. And there's also a lot of other common law cases, such as negligent misrepresentation in hiring, and also identifying if somebody is an independent contractor. So courts, for example, when they're looking at if somebody is an independent contractor, they'll see, did they provide their tools? Do they have control over their work? Do they have some financial risk involved in their work? And is their work integral to the business? Those are some issues that are some factors that they'll look at to determine if somebody's an independent contractor. And so there's consequences to non-compliance. Oftentimes, the violations are subject to an employee filing a complaint. But to protect your organization's workplace productivity, your profitability, and your reputation, it's critical that you comply with the law and make changes when required. Depending on the defense, it could be fines, or it could be remedies to restore the complainant to their original position had the offense not happened. And this can include, for example, reinstatement of the employee, a public apology, compensation, damages. It's also worth noting that companies can be held criminally liable under the Criminal Code for workplace deaths and injuries, and there's been several charges that can be laid against an organization or an individual who's been criminally negligent in directing the work of others. When you consider the financial costs with remedies, legal fees, lost time, and lost morale, damage to the company's image, you can see why it's critical to understand your obligations for the law and why leaving things as is not a sound business strategy. So I'll take this back to Pam.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Kelly. Certainly lots to think about with the legal ramifications, and we're happy that you have done that research for us and know the latest news on that. So now we're going to talk about how do you really determine where your organization, your business is in terms of your human resources. So if as a person, I go to the doctor and I'm going to have a checkup, and they'll check my blood pressure and my weight and my height that doesn't seem to get any taller, but all of the things about myself that are important to my general health. So in the same way, we have an HR checklist. And so we've developed one at Being Human Services that has about 25 items on it. Obviously, today we don't have time to take you through all 25, so we've picked a few of our top favorites, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So one of the things that you might ask yourself are you confident that your organization is compliant with the law? So now that Kelly's talked to us more about that, you maybe have a little more insight into knowing what you didn't know perhaps. Do you have policies and procedures in place to address workplace harassment and psychological well-being? Do you have a system for performance management that includes regular meetings with employees and formal written reviews? And these are things that we suggest are very good ideas for companies. Does your organization have a training program to make sure that your supervisors have the skills that they need to supervise and manage human resources? We all know that many people move up through the ranks and are exceptionally good at the work they do and the tasks they do, and then they're promoted, but they may or may not have had training and experience in managing people. And yet that becomes their main job. So we know often that training people is such a key element. And did you know that the steps and strategies for recruiting and onboarding new employees, and Luke is going to talk more in depth about that as we move on with our presentation today. So those are just a few of the 25 items on the checklist. We have made the checklist available in the manual, in the workbook that we have for sale at the end of this presentation. And we also can work through it with you if you're a member of the Chamber of Commerce. One of our affinity membership rewards is for us to spend some time with you to go through your HR checklist. So one of the fundamental tasks of any human resources department is finding the right people. And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not so easy. It may seem like it's no big deal. So you hire somebody, they don't work out, they leave. But we know that the cost of replacing people is very expensive. And this is where I'm going to ask you in the chat function, just write down the dollar figure that you think it costs to replace a person on average, what that dollar figure would be. And then I'm going to ask Kelly to give us the answer. So just jot that down in the chat. What does it cost? Any wild guesses? I've got $2,000, $20,000, $2,000, $15,000, $100,000. Okay, so Kelly, what's the answer?
Okay, so based on the HR Trends report in 2017 from CPHR Alberta, they said the average cost of processing an employee turnover is $22,600.
Okay, $22,600. So I don't know about you, but for me that would put a little wrinkle in my budget. So and that's the financial cost. Of course, we all know the emotional cost when you lose people, and the cost to morale, and the cost sometimes of losing those customers that they have made a relationship with that employee. So how do you find the right people, and how to determine the need to hire? So the next slide will get us started on that. And that is having a job description. So I guess it's sort of like choosing your destination for a trip, although most of us can't do that for some time. Where can we go? And we need to understand what we're looking for in order to make the decision about where we're going to go. The same thing happens with people. So that's where we really need to have a job description. So I'm going to ask Kelly to walk us through the process about job descriptions, why they're important.
Thank you, Pam. So a lot of the times you may feel that job descriptions are one of the lowest priorities on your list, but they're actually really key for a number of human resource processes. And so there's some benefits to doing this. One is that it allows for clarity for both your employee and you on what their responsibilities are. And they also help distinguish roles within your organization. Have you ever had two people responsible for the same duty and then it never gets done because they anticipate the other person will do it? So this will help distinguish the roles within your organization. They also allow for fair and objective evaluation. How do your employees know what's expected of them? How do they know what's expected of them if they don't know what good performance looks like? And they also help assist with recruitment and selection. How do you know what skills, qualifications, and experience is needed if you're not entirely sure what the job entails? And it also helps you identify proper training and development opportunities for your staff. Having a good idea of what's expected in the role will help you identify what is appropriate for training. Next slide, Marcy. And so part of that is understanding what is in a job description. What does it look like and how do you create one? In HR, many professionals say that job analysis is the cornerstone for human resources. And job analysis is a fair and objective way to figure out what is all involved in a job. You can do job analysis through interviewing, observation, functional job analysis, using job inventories or questionnaires. And once you have a good idea of what's involved in the job, you can start developing them. So common elements include a job title, who the supervisor is, any direct reports that they have, the general purpose of the job, and responsibilities of the job. And this includes the overall objective of those responsibilities. And job specifications. So job specifications include experience, education, skills that are needed for the job, and then also a sign off of approval at the end of the document. And if you already have job descriptions, it's really important to evaluate them to make sure that they're effective. So one important element is to make sure that the job description is based on the role's purpose and actual responsibilities. A common mistake is that they will base the job on the incumbent's abilities instead of the role's actual responsibilities. And each responsibility should include an objective. I see a lot of really generic job descriptions or ones that just list off tasks with little intricacies, but it should state the general reason why they're doing that responsibility. What is the objective of it? And they also should be updated. So our organizations are changing so fast, and so are our roles. So it's important to make sure that we evaluate if they're updated according to what they're currently responsible for. And so that's part of finding the right people, is making a job description. And Luke's going to talk a little bit more about, once you have your job description, how do you find those right people?
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for everyone in joining us today to learn more about the recruitment process and finding the right talent to contribute towards your organization's success and profitability. You want to ensure the person you choose is the best fit for the role and adds value to your current team. Whether you are looking to replace an existing position or expanding with a new position, there are many factors to consider when hiring someone. As an employer, you will ask a few questions on how to successfully navigate the recruitment and onboarding process. The following 10 areas will focus on the most important factors within the recruitment cycle. Next slide, Marcy. So these include identifying the position in need, having a recruitment plan, publicizing your position, reviewing applications, interviewing the most qualified applicants, performing references and background checks, selecting the most qualified candidate, making the job offer and notifying non-chosen applicants, negotiating salary, benefits, and start date, and finally welcoming the new employee. By following this process, employers can find and hire great employees legally and ethically in any labor market. Given the current work environment directly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, I will briefly address specific areas that may require a different approach. So the first step in the hiring process is to identify whether the position you need to fill in your organization is in fact needed. If you are filling an existing position, whether it be due to retirement, promotion, dismissal, or someone leaving for any other reason, you may ask yourself if your current team can take on the additional workload. If not, a suitable person will need to be hired. If your business is growing and you are considering expanding your operations, you may need to hire new personnel. In this case, your business goals will also drive your decision. When you have made the decision to hire a new recruit, you will want to consider your other staff in the process. Those employees that will be affected or will be working with the new hire may need to be involved in the hiring process or at least provide valuable input in what will be required in the sought-after position. Next slide, please. Once you have identified a new recruit is required to fill a position, you will need a recruitment plan to help you through the next stages of the hiring process. Prior to advertising your position to seek out suitable candidates, you will need to ensure your job description and specifications match the skills, experience, and qualifications you require. Feedback from the hiring manager or human resources department will be helpful in developing a job posting that will showcase important qualities, experiences, education, and attributes that candidates will hold. Other important factors to consider in your recruitment plan is what methods you will use to publicize your job posting once it is ready to be advertised. There are several ways of publicizing your job posting to attract new recruits. Some more effective than others, depending on who you may be looking for. These methods will be covered in the next section. You will want to ask yourself who will be involved in reviewing the applications once you start receiving resumes and cover letters. You may want to leave the responsibility to one person, such as the hiring manager, or have multiple people involved, such as human resources staff, or key personnel, such as immediate supervisors. Also, who will be involved during the first and second interviews, and what input will they provide during the interview stage. Finally, it is important to decide who will participate in making the final decision in selecting the successful candidate. Again, this may fall upon the hiring manager or human resources staff. When your recruitment plan is in place and you have addressed some of these questions, it is time to consider publicizing your position. The first thing to consider when publicizing your position is whether you have internal candidates within your organization that may be suitable already. Before advertising your posting to external candidates, you may want to reach out to existing staff and determine if anyone has the skills, talent, and interest in the position. This would allow you to promote from within the organization or allow someone to take on additional workload if possible. Also, it would provide cost savings if unnecessary advertising would not be needed to seek out external applicants. If you determine you will need to post your job externally, you have several methods of attracting suitable candidates. Traditional advertising may include local newspaper classifieds, job boards, or radio TV. It is worth considering your advertising budget and the importance of the position to your business goals. Is this an entry-level position or a manager-supervisor role? Often the case, you will want to advertise your position using online methods such as specific career websites and job boards. These may be less costly than traditional methods and will provide you with a larger candidate pool. If you are seeking a professional position, professional organizations usually allow you to advertise your job posting with them, which will attract specific professions. Another common online networking tool is LinkedIn that can actually bring quality candidates to your attention. In addition, social media or social networks such as Facebook and Twitter can be helpful in promoting your position and expanding your candidate pool. At the same time, these online platforms can be used during your background checks of potential applicants when you arrive at that stage. Ultimately, you want to choose the methods that will be effective and provide a pool of suitable candidates for you to choose from. As a result of your job posting methods, once you have collected enough applicants, you will need to start reviewing your resumes and cover letters that come in. Again, this may be led by human resources or a hiring manager in determining which applicants are the most qualified. It may be useful to use a checklist to compare what each applicant has to offer in the way of skills, qualifications, and education that are required for the position. The most qualified candidates should be pre-screened by a phone interview in order to save time and energy, eliminating candidates who are not as qualified as others. During the phone interview, it can be determined how each applicant may be a good fit for the position and culturally within the organization. Pre-screening questions can be aimed at each applicant to help answer individuals' experience or credentials. After conducting phone interviews and pre-screening qualified candidates, You will want to narrow down the list of candidates to the most qualified. These candidates will be interviewed further, preferably in person, by those that you have selected using a formal structured interview process for all applicants. A structured interview questionnaire will avoid any illegal questions and prevent bias. Given the current environment with the COVID-19 pandemic, an alternative to conducting an interview in person is to schedule a virtual meeting, such as what we're doing right now. Applicants or applications such as Zoom or Skype can help facilitate this virtual interview process. The interview committee may consist of solely the hiring manager, human resources staff, or any personnel that may be working closely with the new employee. Generally, it is recommended that each applicant be interviewed by the same people, as it allows for comparison when you arrive at the final employee selection. Upon scheduling the initial formal employment interview, you may want to ask each applicant for written permission to check references and background information. In some cases, you may want to conduct a second interview to help you in determining between several strong candidates. References and background checks can begin on your strongest candidates, generally during and following your second interviews. You will want to notify any candidates not chosen for interviews and provide a brief explanation on why they were not chosen and move forward to the next recruitment stage. Once you have interviewed your strongest candidates, whether it be after your first or second interview, you will want to conduct references and background checks for each candidate. Background information may include educational credentials, verification of prior employment, skills testing, and internet social media search. Often the best source of information is the applicant's past immediate supervisor or manager. Background checks that have sensitive information, such as criminal background checks, credit checks, drug screening, and physical exams, are better completed after a conditional offer is made to the successful candidate. These should be based on a bona fide occupational requirement. In today's online world, it is common practice for an employer to look at a candidate's public social media presence and postings. This will help you to have a better idea of the person you've gotten to know. LinkedIn profiles and recommendations may provide further information and solidify your choice. So once interviews and background checks have been completed on all potential applicants, it is time to select the most qualified person. Based from your recruitment plan, you will have assigned the designated person or persons to reach a positive decision on a candidate. You will want to review and determine the compensation you will be offering the selected candidate. There are several important factors to consider before you make the actual job offer. Review any feedback information from your interview team. Take note of any feedback given to you from past supervisors or managers. Performance feedback and whether or not they would rehire the employee are important to consider. How do you see the selected candidate fitting within your work culture? Gauge the confidence you have in the potential employee with further training and mentorship if required. Will he or she be open to professional development and progressing within the organization? Ultimately, you will need to consider the overall value the candidate will be bringing to your organization, your existing team, and your customers. At this stage, you may also want to reassess your recruitment process, including your interview questions. Are there areas of the hiring process that you may want to change or be better prepared for with future applications? Perhaps you needed to obtain more information in helping you make a more educated, informed job offer. When we look at the job offer and notifying non-successful applicants, at this stage you will want to present either a verbal or written job offer, given that all references and background checks are complete. If not, the job offer can be contingent on those being completed. The job offer will include salary, benefits, job responsibilities, and the reporting manager. Expected hours of work, desired start date, and additional details can also be covered in the job offer. The initial job offer may be negotiable depending on the position, which will be covered in the next section. Along with presenting a job offer to the selected candidate, you will want to notify the other candidates who you interviewed. Let them know they were strong applicants but not chosen, as someone else has been chosen as the best fit for the position in the organization. It is important to stay in touch with your applicants at every step in your hiring process. Generally, applicants appreciate when employers communicate and offer closure at the end of any application process. After a job offer is received by the selected employee, this stage allows for negotiation of certain terms, depending on the level of the position in the organization. In the two most common areas of negotiation are compensation and paid time off. In the prior stage of offering a job offer, you will want to consider a range of compensation to keep in mind that the counter offer may be made by the selected employee. Certain market factors will have an effect on the negotiation of salary. Some of these include level of the job within your organization, scarcity of the skills and experience needed for the job in the job market, fair market value for the jobs you are filling, salary range for the job within your organization and geographic area, and existing economic conditions within the job market and industry. Depending on these factors, you ought to give yourself some leeway in salary negotiation and accommodating other conditions of employment. Compensation information may be shared by the employer either in the job posting or in the interview stage with prospective employees. This allows under or overqualified candidates to consider this factor when applying for the position. Once compensation and benefits are determined, the start date remains the last area to be settled upon. This often is a compromise between the employer and the employee on a reasonable start date that works for both parties. An employee may have the flexibility of starting right away or may need to provide notice to their previous employer. Lastly, we approach the last stage of the recruitment process, and that is to welcome our new employee to the organization. This stage lays out the groundwork in building a strong working relationship moving forward. It is important to have a new employee feel welcomed and introduced to existing staff. A common practice is to assign a mentor to help the new employee navigate around their new work environment. In addition, an onboarding process may be useful to take care of filling out necessary documents and becoming familiar with company handbooks, benefits, and policy and procedure manuals. You want to maximize the first days of a new employee hire and assist them with their transition while they move forward in contributing to their new organization goals. At this time, I'm going to pass it over to Pam to talk about keeping the right people.
Thank you, Luke. So we've gone to all this trouble to hire, and now we need to think about how we keep people. And it's really important that right from the moment the first conversation you have with someone is an opportunity to build that relationship. One of the other things I just want to mention about hiring, every contact you have with anyone is a potential customer, and someone who's going to go out there in the world and talk to others, about you. So the idea of making those good relationships, right, even with the people that you may not hire in that process, it's going to be really important that you continue to build those positive associations. But once they're on your team, you really want to see how you can keep them. So Marcy, can you pass us on to the next slide? So what we've got here are some of the tools that we use in our human resources practices. And of course, we don't have time today to talk about all of them, but the idea of keeping these things in mind. So we've talked about having a job description. But what about managing the performance of that individual once they get started? What other ways can you keep people engaged and keep them happy to be working for you? Having a safe and healthy workplace psychologically and physically is very, very important, especially during these times of uncertainty with the pandemic. And Luke's already talked about effective onboarding, but also making sure that people have orientation to your organization and know what they need to know right from the beginning, and that they're able to ask questions. And of course, paying people fairly. Fair remuneration is something that can cross over into human rights area, and also in terms of being competitive with the marketplace and keeping people. You know, oftentimes people will say it's not about the money, but money cannot be ignored, and it's a factor. And of course, having a positive workplace culture, having those positive relationships. And that's even more challenging now as we're rebuilding our workplace cultures in the virtual format. So some of the things that we've done to try to keep people together has been some virtual meetings, the reinitiation of talking on the phone to each other when we can't just run down the hall. So I think we've got a little bit more information for you on this one, which is how we can help people to do their job. And so having that overall business plan and strategic plan so that people know what it is, why they're there, what is the meaning of this work. I think the meaning of work, the meaning of life has become even more important in the time of uncertainty. And certainly being able to maintain those positive communication lines at this time when things are so different. And how do you manage performance overall anyway? And how do you do it in this environment of virtual teams? And how do we ensure that people have the development of their professional skills that they need? So these are all some of the tools that human resources professionals use. Now, we've seen that this opportunity, we talked about that earlier today, the opportunity for training has been amazing. Thanks to Apex, we're here today to help you, and there is more training available online. So more than ever, we're beginning to understand that perhaps there are ways that we can do this, and we're going to come out of this pandemic with more resources and tools than we ever had before in terms of how do we help people do their jobs. Next slide, please, Marcy. So I want to turn things back over to Kelly now, who's going to talk to you about performance management. And this is one of the essential tools. What we find when people come to the point the point in their relationship with an employee that they're not happy, the first thing we ask them is, well, what has the performance management looked like? And sometimes people will give us a kind of a, well, we haven't really done that, and it's not an easy thing to do. It actually is an easy thing to do if you've got the right tool. So Kelly, take it away.
Thanks, Pam. So one very important reason to implement a formal performance management process is to reduce your risk of wrongful dismissal allegations should you have to let somebody go for just cause. When making that decision to see if it's a wrongful dismissal, the courts will look to see if you've communicated your expectations to that employee, that you've done so regularly, that there was reasonable effort to help the employee improve in terms of time, resources, and counseling, and evidence that the employee was not willing to improve, and that you had a discussion with them that a failure to improve may lead to termination of employment. Having a performance process with proper documentation will go a long way in helping your case in the event of a wrongful dismissal case. The other side of it is it also helps you to have conversations where you can ultimately reduce the amount of unsatisfactory performance. You can improve communication about any potential supports that your individual employees or your department might need. And it also increases your employee engagement. The more that you take time to communicate, support, and understand your staff, the more they'll be empowered to do good work and stay with your organization. So it was interesting in just recently, the CPHR issued another HR trends report, and they said that the #1 reason that people leave an organization within the last 6 months was for a better opportunity. Now, it was actually 88%. So that's pretty huge. So if you start by having those conversations about their aspirations, their goals, they'll see that you genuinely care about their work, about their career, and that you're here to support them. Pam and I talked about how expensive it is for turnover, $22,600. That's huge. So 2/3 of employers Alberta organizations report experiencing direct impacts of turnover. Most commonly, it's the longer hours of remaining staff, which leads to reduced employee engagement. And 1 in 10 organizations believe that they have not hit their revenue targets because of turnover. So that's pretty huge. So performance management will help you to reduce that turnover and reduce that cost. Taking time to provide feedback, understand your employees' short-term and long-term goals, and also reward your employees for doing good work will go a long way for engagement, productivity, and reducing that turnover. As you can see, your business will thank you. And so overall, the performance management process has some really good purposes. And most people think it helps to evaluate individual performance, which it does, but it also has a lot of other benefits. So it helps you to set goals and objectives and help your employees achieve those goals and objectives. It helps to provide feedback. And it also helps to link training and career development. And a lot of the times, employers will link their compensation program to performance. Having strong performance management process will communicate to your employees again that you care about their work, their aspirations, and you genuinely want them to succeed. And having a good performance management process also means understanding the difference between non-culpable and culpable misconduct, because there's going to be different ways that you do your performance management depending on what kind of misconduct there is. So non-culpable misconduct is unintentional and the employee is not at fault. An example of this is an employee is sick, they're absent because they're sick or they have an illness, or maybe they lack the skills to do the job. And effective performance management, if they lack the skills, is to provide training, counseling, and resources to that individual. The other side of it is they might have culpable misconduct, and culpable misconduct is intentional. It means the employee is at fault. Examples could be that they're always 10 to 15 minutes late coming to work. They tend to extend their breaks, or they're just being lazy and careless in their work in general. And in this case, progressive disciplinary processes is appropriate to use. You should never assume that an employee is making mistakes just simply because they're lazy or careless. Having a good conversation with them to identify that root cause will go a long way. So I wanted to ask this question, and you guys can answer in the chat. When should you conduct performance management with your employees? When do you think it's appropriate to do that? Okay, it's got annually, before there's a problem. That's an interesting one because a lot of employers will do performance management after there's a problem, when situations occur, and then semi-annually and annually. Okay. Good, so it's actually all the time. You should be doing performance management all the time. There's a formal performance management where you do appraisals, whether that's probation or annual performance appraisals, but there's also informal performance management, which is having conversations regularly with your employees on how they're doing, any concerns they might have, what they're doing well, recognizing good work. So you should do this regularly. The conversations that you have when you're doing a performance appraisal annually or semi-annually should never be a surprise. It should be something that you're regularly communicating with them. And this also means that you should document. So good performance management means you should document things. We saw that courts will look for evidence of an employment relationship no longer being viable if there's a wrongful dismissal complaint, and this documentation will provide evidence of that. The progressive disciplinary process typically involves a series of written warnings. The first one's usually verbal, but you should still record this. And it also should communicate the infraction and give them time to improve. Typically, there's 3 warnings before ultimately terminating someone's employment, but the misconduct might be serious enough that you just go straight to the termination step. There's also a performance enhancement plan, which is a really great way to formally document any discussions that you have when you're discussing performance management with your employees. A performance enhancement plan will have relevant dates of incidents, any previous discussions that you had about similar incidences, details of the incident, and the consequences. So you should communicate with your staff, what are the consequences of this performance concern? Then you should schedule a follow-up date to discuss how things are going. Is there any further action that needs to be taken? Any comments from the supervisor and the employee? And a key element is a signature from the employee that they understand that a failure to improve will lead to more serious discipline or even termination of employment. Again, we saw this is something that the courts will look for. And all documentation should be kept confidential and put in their human resources file. And I thought this was a really cute cartoon. So your valuation is based on the next 30 seconds. Go. And this is kind of funny, but it's true in a way, whether we like it or not. We all have unconscious biases based on our specific experiences that we have. And training your supervisors to know what their biases are will go a long way to help make sure that their performance management is fair and objective. One really good example that this cartoon illustrates is a lot of the times employers will just look at recent events before their performance appraisal to make judgments about how they're doing. And in fact, a lot of employees know this, and they'll purposely improve their performance right around their performance appraisals. So it's actually really important that you eliminate this recency bias, what they call it, and make notes throughout the year on how people are doing. Anything that they're doing well, anything that they need to improve on, what discussions did you have? There's other types of biases. For example, people tend to rate people who are similar to them more higher than people who are maybe a little bit different than them. So it's really good to understand what the biases are and make sure that your supervisors are trained on how to mitigate those. And it's also really important to make sure that your supervisors know how to have those difficult discussions with their employees. So planning ahead what you're going to say to your employee will help you look more composed, more genuine, and that you're clear on what needs to be changed. So examples might be a long-term employee who is checked out, somebody who has personal hygiene problems that's maybe affecting the customers. Maybe somebody disagrees with your performance appraisal assessment. What kinds of things can you say? Or simply somebody is not meeting your expectations. They're falling asleep behind the desk there. So what are you going to say to them? So for example, it's really important to make sure that when you give them feedback, you're providing specific examples and talking about the performance, not the individuals themselves. So instead of saying, Kelly, you're just so unorganized, say, Kelly, I've noticed that for the past 3 meetings, you've been 10 minutes late and you've been unprepared with all of the information that we needed. How can we help support you so that you're on time and have the information prepared ahead of time? Another good rule of thumb is to make sure that you that you're fair and consistent and genuine with your feedback. The feedback it should be about the person and not about it should be about the performance and not the person themselves. Next slide, Marcy. Perfect. And ultimately, you might have to exit those people when it's required. If they're not a good fit with your organization, maybe you've done some progressive disciplinary processes and it ends up that they're just not a good fit. As we saw, turnover is very expensive. When possible, take the steps necessary to identify what is the root cause of the performance issue. Is it a culpable misconduct or non-culpable? Provide time and support to help them to improve. And when terminating, if you do have to, make sure that you follow your company policies and procedures, any legislative requirements that you might need, and also any contractual obligations that you may have based on their employment contract. Perfect. So I'll trade this over to Pam again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kelly. Well, I'm really glad to see that we've moved along quite quickly, which means we'll have a little bit of time for question and answers at the end of the presentation today. I want to let you know a little bit more about what's coming up in the next webinars. On May 27th, we have Peggy Giesen talking about everything DISC workplace. So DISC is tool, a personality tool that helps to determine what the differences are in people's work styles and work preferences, things that stress them, things that motivate them. And Peggy will give some information about how these factors can be so helpful and some tools to use in your workplace. There will be workplace assessments available through, they're done online, and they've got a lot of information, and those will be available online before the workshop if you like. It's not mandatory to have the assessment for the workshop, but it can be helpful. Then Peggy is going to deal with personality dimensions, customer service on June 3rd. And we know that customer service and sales is so important right now. And understanding your customers, understanding yourselves, your sales team, and how you can put the best combinations of things together to have good results. And some of just the, pardon me, the practical considerations of how we may need to do things differently in the new normal, as they say, after COVID-19. And then on June 17th, everything productive conflict. Again, assessments are available for this. They're not mandatory, but the idea is understanding yourself and your team members and how different people deal with conflict in different ways. We know that building trusting relationships is at the heart of dealing with conflict. And we've all had some challenges in that as we've moved to the virtual formats. So we think that these workshops will be very helpful for you, and they're all provided through Apex at no charge. You'll be asked, just as you were today, to register in advance and then to join the workshop online. So
I'm just going to jump in for 1 second. So before we lose anybody, I want to do the exit survey so that we know what our numbers are at the end as well as the beginning, and then you can continue talking, Pam, while they are doing that, or you can wait until I take it off and then continue talking. Sorry, I just want to make sure that we are able to see what our differences are from beginning to end.
Sure. Let's give people a minute just to answer that survey. We've got time. It'll help us to know how we did and if we need to get more information to you. And then we're going to move on to some questions and answers.
Just give another 5 seconds or so here. We'll do
Sure.
1 minute on that. Okay, ending the poll. There you go.
Thanks, Sandra. So just to remind everyone that the downloadable manual is available for $20. So we wanted to just recover some of the costs of putting that together. And it's going to contain all of the information that we've had today, and plus some more, and some reference material for you. Also, it will have the full human resources checklist. And if you don't want to buy the manual, we're going to suggest that you can get in touch with us if you're a member of the Chamber of Commerce and have our free consultation, which includes the checklist. That gives you a chance, rather than just do the checklist in isolation, it provides us with an opportunity to frame some of the materials in a more constructive way for you. Kelly Moody is going to be available to you at kelly.moody@beinghumanservices.ca, and so she can help you with any questions or with ordering your manual. And we would be very happy to be in touch with you and hear more from you as we move forward. So I think that's it for me, except maybe hosting some questions and answers.
Can you see that question in the chat, Pam?
Oops, just a second, chat. Okay. We had a question from an employer about vetting potential employees as she needs to hire, but isn't sure how personal she can get in the interview. There are immune-compromised people working for her, and she doesn't want to hire anyone that might be high risk of contracting COVID. she used the example of someone living in a home with a lot of people, family or not. Can you screen for this? So I think we need to be quite careful. I am going to call on Kelly to jump in here, though, because I know, Kelly, you've done a little bit more of this work.
I'm just going to jump in 1 second, Kelly, before you start. So one of the things about, because my daughter's immune compromised, so one of the things that they've stated about immune compromised people is that they're not any more likely to get COVID than anyone else. It's that if they get it, because their immune system is compromised, they may have more complication. So go ahead, Kelly. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So that's a really good question. It does have some human rights elements. So what I would say to that employer is that they need to be very careful with the questions that they ask. They can't ask if they have a lot of family members living with them, for example, because that's part of those protected grounds under the Human Rights Act. What I would say is, I mean, you could be honest with the person during the interview and say that they have they're trying to be very careful with their safety in regards to the COVID-19, and asking them if there's any safety or any.
That is a tough one.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna jump in here for a minute. I think what we all understand as we return to work is that many people who, because COVID can be passed by people who have no symptoms, we can't always rely on just checking for symptoms, although we know that's a good thing to do. But I think we have to act as if everyone we come in contact is potentially a person who doesn't know that they have the virus, and do everything we possibly can in terms of those health and safety measures. So, you know, I think we have to assume that we're going to be doing everything possible. I think the risk of making initiating bias into the hiring process is very dangerous, and I think we want to abide by the human rights legislation as it exists. There has been no change to human rights legislation as a result of COVID-19.
I like Lisa's answer to her own question. She said they did tell the employer to reach out to an HR specialist or an HR lawyer. And I would think that that would be a lawyer question.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we have another question. How do you deal with performance management for an employee who has the capabilities and capacity to do a job? They have the skills and abilities, but they have personal obstacles and challenges that are impacting their work performance. Perhaps it's a personal situation of family violence, or a situation where dealing with a mental health disorder. We did tell the employer to reach out to an HR specialist or a lawyer. So again, I think this falls under the duty to accommodate. When you believe that someone has some issues not relating to their capabilities, really offering, you know, having that conversation, as Kelly talked about, being very specific about what it is you see about their performance that's not measuring up, and offering to discuss it with them. How can you help? Kelly, do you want to, and Luke, do you want any comments you want to add to that answer?
I agree. There's a human rights element to that too, where, for example, if it's an issue of family violence, there's two issues with that. So it falls under that human rights where the employer has the duty to accommodate, and also under the Employment Standards Code, there's a job protected leave of absence of up to 10 days for family violence, for example. So being aware of those as well, and asking how you can help that employee if they relay that information to you.
It also falls under occupational health and safety.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, it has a couple elements in there, and I think, like Pam said, have a discussion, determine what the root cause is, because a lot of the times it is something that has a human rights element, and it's a non-culpable misconduct. So making sure that where you need to, you're accommodating that person.
I've got an interesting one. I'm just going to blurt it out. So not only do I have a daughter who's immunocompromised, I have a son who is autistic, and so he received a job at a grocery store, and when he was in the interview for the first time ever, he told the interviewer that he is autistic, which is really, as a mother of an autistic kid, that is huge. And so he's now been working there for just over 3 months, probably 4 or 5 months now. And he's having some troubles. So one of the troubles he's having is he doesn't do change well. And they moved him from an evening shift from 4:30 to 10:30, which he really liked. He had a specific job. He understood the job. He got the job done. He did it well. But in the system, it's like a benefit to be moving up on the seniority scale, and they offered him a job working straight days, which a lot of people really love. So from 7:30 until like 3:30 in the afternoon. So he said he would try it, but that he wasn't sure if he would like it, and he wanted to be able to be moved back should he really dislike it. And so they agreed to that, and they put him on the day shift, and he said he would try it for a month, and he did do it for a month, and he hates it. It's a different job. He's got to deal with people, which he doesn't like, needs to know where the exits are, has to deal with more people. Just a ton of issues for him with regard to that. And so he said to his boss, I need you to switch me back. And the boss said, well, we can't because of the collective agreement, yada, yada. So now they're blaming the union's blaming the management, and he's stuck in the middle saying, but I told you I was autistic and I really need to be working a different shift. Is that a duty to accommodate?
Absolutely. That's absolutely a duty to accommodate. And again, that's a really good example of how, when you do the right accommodation, almost every situation can be managed. So I would hope that if there's a union representative, someone would reach out to that person and perhaps get them in touch with an advocate or a specialist on autism to help explain the reason why. And, it's so funny with accommodations for disabilities. A lot of times people just think about wheelchair ramps, and that's probably one of the least needed. Not that it's not needed if you're in a wheelchair, but there's so many other invisible disabilities that need to have accommodations. And usually they're so simple, and it can be something as simple as changing a shift. So I would definitely urge that employer to contact someone with that specialization and give them some more information.
Perfect. Thank you.
That's good. All right, we're at 11:23. I don't know if there's any more questions.
I don't see any more.
Don't see any more. Okay, well, I am very happy that we were able to share this information with you, and I really would invite you all to reach out if you have more questions. If you want to get the manual, we will certainly make that available, or if you would like to use the affinity program of the Chamber of Commerce, we'd be happy to meet with you individually, virtually for now, and take it from there. Thank you, Kelly, Luke, Sandra, and all of you, and Marcy for being our producer and switching our slides. And we hope that you'll join us for the upcoming workshops as they become available in the next few weeks.
Thank you so much, Pam, and your staff at Being Human Services. Being Human Resources. This was spectacular. I really am happy with the way it went. There was a lot of really great content. And just so you know, I'll send you the actual numbers from the entry to the exit survey, but there isn't one area that you asked about that people didn't bump up their knowledge to a different level. So I'll send you the actual results.
Perfect.
We're done. So thank you both very much, and I'll see you in a week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone,
Stay safe.
for attending.